Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this event. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Danielle Shapiro. I'm a sophomore here, and I am proud to serve as president of the Princeton Open Campus Coalition, which is Princeton's student group committed to truth-seeking and open discourse on campus. We regularly host interesting speakers and events on campus and also educate the student body on issues that relate to our mission. So if you're a student and you're not currently involved, please come up to me after. I'd love to speak to you. So this event today is hosted by the Princeton Free Speech Union, a group that includes the Princeton Open Campus Coalition, Princetonians for Free Speech, and like-minded faculty and staff. And we're extremely excited to be hosting our second event, major event of the semester. So to learn more about Princetonians for Free Speech and their work on campus, you can find Kaylee or Matthew Wilson, and you can also find them on Instagram and other social medias. So this afternoon, we have the distinct pleasure to be hearing from Greg Lukianoff, the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE. Greg Lukianoff is an attorney, New York Times bestselling author, and the president and CEO of FIRE. He is the author of Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of the American Debate, Freedom from Speech, and FIRE's Guide to Free Speech on Campus. Most recently, he co-authored The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, with Jonathan Haidt. The New York Times bestseller expands on their September 2015 Atlantic cover story of the same name. He is a co-author of the upcoming The Canceling of the American Mind with Ricky Schlott. Greg is also an executive producer of Can We Take a Joke, a feature-length documentary that explores the collision between comedy, censorship, and outrage culture, both on and off campus. Mighty Ira, a Civil Liberties Story, an award-winning feature-length film about the life and career of former ACLU Executive Director Ira Glasser. So today we're going to be hearing from Greg directly, and then there'll be a period for questions and answers. So if you have something, please raise your hand, and one of the mic runners will come and grab the question. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Greg.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm of course honored to be here. I should confess I am hopped up on allergy medicine, and I made my presentation a little bit too long, but I want to cover a lot of ground. Today I want to talk about what I call the Conformity Gauntlet in higher education, because I've been defending free speech on campus for 22 years, and at every step, from the admissions process on up, there's pressure to conform. Conform your opinions, conform your speech, conform your research. And I tried to put most of it in one place, which is one of the reasons why this is a somewhat long presentation. So I'm going to try to go through these stories pretty fast, because I love questions and I want to get to them, but I got a lot of ground to cover at the same time. So I think about it as like, imagine that you're an independent-minded high schooler who longs to be a famous scientist, for example, one day. And if you are someone who is contrary, if you are someone who, for example, sometimes makes fun of people on both political sides of the fence, it's very easy to be labeled conservative. And as we talk about in Canceling of the American Mind, that has become, as dumb as it seems, a way to have your opinion very quickly dismissed. I am myself a political liberal, but I, of course, am very often dismissed as conservative too. And it's a childish tactic, but really effective in higher education today. So what do I mean by the Conformity Gauntlet? I probably won't cover this whole thing, but when I talk about cancel culture, what I'm talking about is a dramatic uptick in people getting punished for what they had to say as of 2014, particularly professors, particularly students. And now, if you get in trouble in high school, which happens quite a bit, and particularly if it's for saying something political, in 2020 we saw people lose their admissions to Harvard. I'm not sure if we saw them in Princeton, but I'm sure that happens as well. So it's very easy to get in trouble there. And then at every level of this process, you have your diversity, equity, and inclusion statements, which I am kind of blown away that people are still trying to argue at some level that these aren't political litmus tests. There's literally no way that these can't be political litmus tests. They are about evaluating your political commitment to certain political causes. And they happen at every level now of the admission process, whether it's college, whether it's PhD programs. And they're being usually evaluated by people who are potentially pretty hostile, particularly if they want to label you conservative. So I have this whole, you can read it yourself about the many steps. And if you get through student teaching without being canceled, virtually no protections. Once again, you have to submit DEI. If you earn tenure, likely submitting another DEI statement as part of the process without being canceled. And by cancel, I basically define it as getting punished for your opinion. I have a very simple definition of cancel culture. Survive a career in higher ed despite the dramatically weakened job security offered by tenure, and also survive cancel culture from the right, if you should say something that pisses them off on the Twitters. And then, Nature and Scientific American are now saying that if you survived all that, that they might not publish you if they think that your work is in some vague way harmful, irrelevant. What is not emphasized there is if it's true. And of course, you can survive all that and still get disinvited, still get shouted down, and we've seen a big, scary uptick in shout downs just in the past couple of months. So I'm going to put some of the data that we've discovered here, but I'm going to pepper in a couple of stories. An example of how ridiculous it can be on campus is Emerson College in Massachusetts. This is a school that when students, where this student put something up saying China kind of sus, which has a CCC flag on it, which is clearly talking about the government of China, and sus means suspicious. They got punished, and this woman got accused of anti-Asian hate when she's actually being critical of the government of China. That's a case we've been fighting for a while. She actually left the school, unfortunately, after the incident. DEI statements, good news is at least 50% of surveyed professors know that these are political litmus tests, and when it comes to moderates, that's an even higher chunk. And of course, 90% of conservatives know these are political litmus tests. Like literally, you're asking to be evaluated on your political beliefs. So of course they are. The idea that there are people who don't think they're political litmus tests still kind of blows me away. And here's the most striking thing. 23% of tenure track professors said they view DEI statements as ideological litmus tests and think they're appropriate. That was not a combination I was expecting to see. Nearly a quarter of them are like, oh, great, political mistest. That's swell. Well, welcome back to McCarthyism. That's one of the reasons why we actually supported a law banning political litmus tests of any kind, whether they're loyalty oaths for patriotism, which we say very explicitly, or loyalty oaths towards any ideology. And now we know that 46% of large institutions surveyed by the AUP require DEI statements. And that number looks to get closer to 80% as the remainder of schools, almost all of them, are considering having them. And this is at a point where the idea that someone could look at the environment on American college campuses in 2020 and say it was not politically homogenous enough just kind of blows me away. So let's see how these are used, and we need more transparency in how they're used. But DEI statements, 76% of faculty applicants to UC Berkeley's Life Sciences department were eliminated solely on the basis of their diversity statements by administrators. 52% of faculty who evaluated diversity statements, this was an experiment that my colleague Nate Honeycutt did that's fascinating. He did an experiment where he got a huge number of professors and administrators to do a simulated diversity and inclusion evaluation. And 52% of them dismissed out of hand, as in like you wouldn't make it through the door, diversity statements that talked about viewpoint diversity as opposed to racial or ethnic diversity. The one that really breaks my heart is the next one, and it's 35% were rejected out of hand, when they argued socioeconomic diversity, which drives me insane because as far as one of the things that I think is a really toxic to particularly elite higher education today is how few people they have from the bottom 60, 70% of the economic economic distribution. I think the numbers are something like, at Stanford where I went, I think it's something like there are more people from the 1% of the economic distribution than there are from the 60 or 70% of the rest. And I personally find that outrageous. So the idea that making this argument will get you more than a quarter of the time, 35% of the time, just dismissed out of hand, I think it's outrageous. 45% of faculty applicants to UC Santa Cruz were eliminated through DEI screening. And again, all throughout this experience, you are facing getting in trouble for just sometimes kind of nonsense. In this case, Yale actually very much earned our Lifetime Achievement Award for censorship a couple of years ago. And one of the cases is this student. He sent an email that was supposed to be for a get-together with the Multicultural Students Association to have some fun. And he talked about, oh yeah, we're gonna have like a total trap house, which as far as he knew was slang for a place where you hang out and drink and party. And he got written up because this was apparently originally came from black slang, and that was somehow deeply offensive to the entire community. And amazingly, the administrator who started to say, it's like, listen, you're gonna need to pass the bar, and you're gonna have to have people who vouch for your ethics. A really not veiled threat that we will ruin your career unless you sign this pre-prepared apology for saying trap house. Now, if I sound a little bit outraged, it's because I've been doing this for 22 years, and it does keep getting worse. And it isn't always political. This case I find particularly ridiculous. This is Kimberly Day, I always sort of stumble over her name, Kimberly Day, I believe it's pronounced, University of Tennessee. She was a pharmacy student, and in her private life, she posts homages to Cardi B, the sometimes very salacious hip-hop artist. And she was told that she was punished for this because apparently, I guess, you don't want to have a pharmacist who likes hip-hop. These are the kind of things that I have to deal with a lot. And basically, like, the idea was somehow that would be a breach of professionalism for pharmacists. So discrimination hiring, oh my God, like it's the fact that you actually have faculty admitting that they discriminate against conservatives is a very bad sign. 22% of faculty willing to explicitly discriminate against a Trump supporter in hiring. 1/3 of liberal California University faculty at least somewhat willing to discriminate against conservatives in hiring. 49% of graduate students endorsed ousting a faculty member who expressed conservative views. 49%. That's 56% of philosophy department faculty at least occasionally willing to discriminate against conservatives in hiring. And again, to be clear, when we say to conservatives, at this point, that's pretty much anyone who dissents. And this is the problem with the whole kind of what I call the perfect rhetorical fortress. Once you make the childish argument that if I can label you conservative, I don't have to listen to you anymore, the intellectually lazy habit is to then label everyone you disagree with as conservative. The most interesting ones I've seen lately are people accusing the ACLU and the New York Times of being right-wing when they don't like what they have to say. And when it comes to discrimination in hiring, one of the most powerful cases that I know of was my old friend, Mike Adams, someone I was defending from my very first days at FIRE. Mike is absolutely a bomb-throwing social conservative, but he was brave, and he was always trying to be funny. Unfortunately, he credited me with encouraging him to be funny, because at the time that we first talked for the first case when I had to defend them, I was reading the biography of Lenny Bruce. He started reading it as well, and he's like, you know what, Greg, I'm going to be more of a bomb thrower. I'm going to be more in people's faces with my conservative beliefs. And he's someone who came in as a left liberal who became an evangelical Christian while he was at UNCW. Because like a lot of even the conservatives that are really conservatives on campus, oftentimes they're more libertarian. Social conservatives are comparatively rare. So his discrimination in hiring happened. He was one of the best published people at UNCW. He was denied tenure. He fought against that decision and won a victory for every single professor in the Fourth Circuit that overcame Garcetti v. Ceballos, a case that actually it left some ambiguity about whether or not professors could essentially be fired for their speech. He won a huge victory for them, and in 2020, he thought he was cracking a joke that was slightly edgy on Twitter about lockdowns, and he said, he said, I'm with my buddies, like at a bar right now, the lockdown is briefly over, and he said, Massa, whoever the governor was of North Carolina, let my people go. And apparently because he used Massa as a way of saying that you're treating us, like your property, that was enough to get him terminated from UNCW. Now, they knew they'd lost a case to him before, so they had to settle with him, and he got he got a settlement that was, honestly wasn't so great in my opinion, but I thought he was fine, so I didn't check in on him after he got fired, because in 2020 we saw more cases just in that month than we used to see in a year, and I thought Mike was going to be okay. He always seemed preternaturally confident, and when I called him finally in July, after he'd already agreed to the settlement and clearly was having some regrets about it, and he was being stalked by a number of protesters who were calling him and telling him that they saw his children and wife who don't exist giving oral sex to black protesters. Like he even called the police, and a week after I talked to him, he killed himself. And there is cancel culture from the right. Fire does not, Fire fights that as well. As far as one of the dumbest cases I've seen in my career, it's this one coming out of Babington College in Massachusetts. When Trump was talking about attacking cultural sites in Iran, he cracked a joke about, hey, Ayatollah Khomeini, and this guy knows that Ayatollah Khomeini is long dead, we should tweet a list of 52 beloved sites of American cultural heritage that he should bomb. The Mall of America, the Kardashian residence. This got written up like he was seriously advising the Ayatollah of Iran about where to attack in the United States, and he was almost immediately fired. And it's like, this is so, when you have a Kardashian joke in there, it's clearly a joke. And then, of course, one of the things that we have fought are overbroad attempts to get at some of these problems, like the Stop Woke Act in Florida. We take some flack sometimes from the right for litigating against that. I actually believe passionately in higher ed reform. I think it needs to happen, but if you do something, make it constitutional, because it's not going to survive anyway. And yeah, fire's going to challenge it. If it's a violation of the First Amendment, we will challenge it. And we won this battle against the Stop Woke Act in Florida pretty quick. So Conformity Gauntlet, even at MIT. 40% of faculty there said that they were more concerned about sharing their beliefs than they were even in 2020, which was already a really bad year. Only 5% said they were less or less likely to self-censor. MIT students, 68 are uncomfortable with publicly disagreeing with the professor. 51% are uncomfortable expressing disagreement with one of their professors. MIT should have the best environment for freedom of speech, and it ended up being about the middle of the pack in our free speech rankings, but you would expect a science school to be right at the top. And of course, we have the Dorian Abbott situation there. 48% of students say it's never okay to block, only 48% of students say it's never okay to block students from attending a speech. Only 48%. The correct answer is it is never okay to block your fellow students from attending a speech. And only 23% said it's never okay to shout down a speaker. It's not okay. That is mob censorship. The fact that, and people who claim not to understand that would immediately understand it if it was a speaker that they liked. And a snapshot of viewpoint diversity in elite higher ed. This is Princeton. That's what 1 out of 40 looks like. It's gotten so much worse just within my career. And by the way, one of the things that was interesting when I was working on Coddling in the American Mind with Haidt is that there was a kind of a first grade age of political correctness from about 1985 to 1995. People kind of thought it ended with a lot of defeats of speech codes. The last one was at my alma mater, Stanford Law School. And it looked like political correctness had passed. The professors were no longer, at least nominally, all that into speech suppression. So there was a sense, and there was actually a supposed expert of academic freedom who said this all ended in 1995, and the speech codes got a decent burial. That was just not true, and that was lazy of him to assert that, because speech codes actually increased, and the lack of viewpoint diversity in hiring it just plummeted in the late 90s when everybody took their eye off the ball. And I started working in this field in 2001, and already it was worse than I was expecting. A snapshot of diversity in elite higher ed. This is Harvard. Yeah, not great. Self-censorship in higher ed. From the big study that we did, we found about 91% of professors at least somewhat likely to self-censor on social media, in class, in publications, or online. We compared that to, have you ever even toned down anything you have written lately because you were worried it might cause too much controversy? At the height of McCarthyism, 9% of professors said that was that they were self-censoring. 16% of professors say they have been disciplined or threatened with discipline for their speech, teaching, or academic research. I really want to emphasize that. That means tens of thousands of professors. That is way worse than I thought, and I know it's bad. 29% of professors say they've been pressured by administrators to avoid controversial research. And will tenure protect you in the conformity gauntlet? Probably not. We've seen 60 tenured professors fired since 2000 for things that should be protected by tenure. That has wildly accelerated since 2014 and 2017. And then, of course, here's the thing that makes you sound crazy for people who don't know a lot about this. Some of this stuff happens in secret. One of the things about FIRE is that we get calls all the time from professors saying that I've been accused of something, it's nominally called harassment, it's explicitly about my speech, and they're saying I can't tell anyone that I'm being charged and that this is going on. Laura Kipnis, this happened to her in 2015. She wrote an article saying that Title IX was being used to censor, to cut down on speech. Then she got brought up on charges of violating Title IX by Northwestern University and was told that she couldn't know who was charging her, she couldn't know what the charges were, she couldn't talk to a lawyer, it was all done in secret, and finally, to her credit, after 72 days, she took it public. And then, magically, Northwestern discovered that they didn't actually have to investigate her. Then, of course, she wrote a book about it, which everyone should read, called Unwanted Advances. And then, of course, she was brought up again on charges of violating Title IX. And Ann Applebaum at the Atlantic has also covered this. So that's one of the reasons why that 16%, makes a sad kind of sense to me. That a lot of these cases will never see the light of day. So, and these are the ones that do see the light of day, and they're terrible. These are the numbers of professors targeted, fired, or otherwise sanctioned since 2000. It is, to say the least, been somewhat of an increase over the past couple of years. I had never seen a year as bad as 2020, and 2021 was even worse. And what's remarkable is this is happening at a time of record low viewpoint diversity and multiple systems like bias-related incident programs, speech codes, secret hearings. There's already so many ways to demand conformity, and still professors are getting fired at record numbers. And I really do mean record numbers. And this one, yes, about 54% of those come from the left, but a substantial number of those also come from the right. I want to be very clear about that. When it comes to cancel culture for students, our research indicates it's overwhelmingly from the left, and that's not surprising because there's not that many conservative students to begin with at a lot of schools. And when it comes to comparing it, actually, I don't love this chart because all of the research that we found on the Red Scare, the most common number that was given was about 100 professors were terminated for their political beliefs during the Red Scare. Some of the research I saw made me think it actually was probably even somewhat lower than that, but the stretch claim is about 150. We're way past that, and we're not even at the 10-year mark, just like McCarthyism is. We're at 156 fired. So when people try to claim, there was something by Adam Gurry that he wrote saying that if any other problem were happening in American society, we would consider it effectively solved. And it's like, okay, you could have just admitted you know nothing about this topic. Because unless you think the Red Scare was no biggie, which I really doubt you do, you should care about this. And I'm still dealing with people claiming this isn't happening at all. And of course, we still see spectacularly bad cases, like at Hamline University. And this is the funny thing. People were starting to tell me that cancel culture, some of the same people who told me cancel culture didn't exist started telling me that cancel culture was over earlier this year. And I'm hopeful that you eventually run out of witches to burn, and everybody gets in the line. So it has to end at some point. So maybe it was starting to, and then we get into the last 6 months, and they've been terrible. Hamline University, this is a case where in an art class, a professor who had put this on her syllabus, who had warned students that they were going to show an image of the prophet, and then warned them again in the class that they didn't need to attend if they found this offensive. They showed this image. And what's interesting about this image is there's Americans, and this is where my Russian Britishness comes out. Americans can be very funny and parochial in their understanding of the rest of the world, because there's an assumption that this is offensive to all Muslims, which of itself is offensive to an awful lot of Muslims, because this is devotional art made by a Muslim for a Muslim. Not all Muslims believe that the depictions of Muhammad, that it's always offensive to show them, particularly when they're not in any way insulting, when they're devotional. But this was assumed to be offensive when one student complained, and this professor lost her job and has not been rehired at Hamline University in Minneapolis, in Minnesota. And like I said, Nature Human Behavior came out talking about how they won't publish things that can be argued to be harmful to groups. And what can be argued harmful to groups? So far I've seen practically anything can be if it's controversial in any sense. So the idea that you can survive the whole gauntlet and still not get published in major scientific journals if you find something that's too controversial is not great. And then the increase of the campus shoutdowns. We just had one with Riley Gaines at San Francisco State University. They're really overachieving. She claimed that she was hit by a protester. In addition to it being a shoutdown, it being something that really got out of control. The Kristen Wagner situation at Yale. I really want to stress here, I cannot find parallels to this in academic history where elite law schools have shoutdowns of. And at Yale, it was students. It was a liberal jurist, a liberal lawyer who presents in front of the Supreme Court, and a conservative lawyer from the Alliance Defending Freedom. And it was supposed to be a kumbaya session about things that the right and the left can agree on, and they shouted it down. But even worse, at my alma mater, they shouted down a circuit court judge. We cannot find another example of someone of that rank as a judge being shouted down anywhere. Maybe there's something that happened in the 60s or 70s. We're going to be looking into it. And I've had to deal with people claiming that this is just more speech, which I don't like to immediately jump to questioning people's sincerity, but this one I have a hard time with. If you had, so for the first 10 minutes, they shouted him down, and we've documented that's in the transcript. Then an administrator gets up, takes over the event, and gives a speech, basically saying, talking about, is the juice worth the squeeze? But by what she means in that is, first, is it worthwhile to have this circuit court judge to talk at this school? And of course the answer is, of course it is. He's one level below the Supreme Court. Like, this is one of the most powerful judges in the country, and your future lawyers, of course you're going to want to hear from him. And blamed him for the divisiveness that had been caused at Stanford. Meanwhile, conservative judges have talked at Stanford for decades. The idea that this was his fault that he caused the divisiveness. And then, to Duncan's credit, he stayed for another 20 minutes to try to answer questions, most of which were not in good faith. Someone asking him about whether or not he could find the clit. Someone talking about that I can find the prostate. Why can't you? It was. I've never seen anything like it, and watching people still try to defend it. It just blows my mind. It's mob censorship, and they would immediately get it if it was someone. If this happened to a speaker that they liked. In fact, if it happened to a speaker they liked, those students would probably be accused of harassment and probably kicked out of school. So I want to leave you with a quote about a nation that does not educate in liberty will not long endure in liberty and will not even know when it's lost, by Alan Charles Kors. So I didn't expect the tone of this to be quite so frustrated, but if this isn't bad enough, you cannot convince people that there's a problem. And I am frustrated because it has gotten worse pretty much every year for years now. I don't think this is sustainable, but yet we go on as if nothing's wrong. So, ta-da! It's kind of funny, like in Coddling the American Mind, Haidt and I, with the final chapter, we wanted to make it a little more positive. And I was a little bit like, do we really feel like things are going to be getting a lot better anytime soon? But we wanted to leave it on a more positive note. And I kind of regret it to some degree because we thought things actually were going to get worse before they get better. And in Canceling of the American Mind, we're talking about really radical changes that we think need to happen. Because if this isn't bad enough, nothing is. So anyway, on that happy note, questions? Oh, this is usually, over here. Yeah.
I think I can. Yeah, you're good.
I can hear you.
I've heard you can't take it. Yeah. I've heard you, right, they can't record.
Oh, okay, got it.
Thank you again. I've heard you describe before how so many of these cases involve administration acting non-ideologically, just out of a reflex to smother and stifle anything controversial, anything, just conformity, really, just keep things quiet, and that they're so often so egregiously against the law that FIRE has had a great success rate in getting it dismissed or defeating them in court, and you described it as a kind of whack-a-mole, but you are whacking them. Does that give you any sense that, look, these things are, for the most part, rather weak efforts, or do you think there's been a qualitative difference in the last few years in the kind of things happening where this is not going to be resolved by, say, the Woke Act type thing where you just go to the nearest court and it gets thrown out immediately?
Yeah, well, there has been a qualitative shift in what I've seen. For most of my career, we did have administrators overreach, and a lot of times it wasn't all that political. Sometimes it was, the individual politics, oftentimes of a mid-level administrator. Occasionally you have the case where it's coming right from the top, it's coming from the university president. Sometimes it's ideological. A lot of times it's more about public relations. But as of 2020, the ideological patina on everything has been dominant, and it's been scary and depressing. And like I said, at a moment when things are already pretty, professors are already quite chilled, there's not a lot of viewpoint diversity to begin with, and they're still finding professors to fire. So it has gotten more ideological. And when it comes to, when we have the First Amendment, we win routinely, but we know that an awful lot of these cases never see the light of day to begin with. And that's one of the reasons why you need massive reform. There should not be secret hearings about freedom of speech. There should not be bias-related incident programs where you can anonymously report on your professors. Should not be all of these administrators. And then one thing, an accusation that I'm willing to make, because I've seen it in action many times, in a lot of cases, it's not just that the administrators don't punish the students for shouting down speech. And we've seen this in action, and I think it happens more often than people know. The administrators help organize it in many cases. When it comes to at Stanford, when I talk to the students, they're like, oh yeah, the administrators who were supposed to be shutting down the shout down, and Judge Duncan came to Stanford with the promise that if students try to shut it down, those students will be asked to go. And it actually turns out that for hours before the event, there were some administrators who were actually meeting with the protesters beforehand. So I think in a lot of cases, it's not just that administrators don't punish students for doing this. I think a lot of times they're actually putting them up to it. And unfortunately, that's one of the reasons why we need greater transparency. I think we should make as part of accepting federal aid some amount of ability to FOIA information relating to threats to academic freedom. Because it's the most glaring case we saw of this was at Washington State University earlier in my career. We talk about this in the documentary, Can We Take a Joke? It was an African-American comedian. He was doing something called The Passion of the Musical with the stated goal of offending everybody as much as possible. And administrators literally bought people who wanted to protest tickets and they were dumb enough to write this down, and we found it. And to get up in the middle of the event and start saying, I'm offended, in the middle of it. And shock upon shock, when you get a bunch of angry students to go shout down a play, sometimes it gets a little out of hand, and pretty soon it was turning into, I'm going to fucking kill you. to Chris Lee in this case. So I believe there's a lot more of organizing this stuff than people understand. I think that what a lot of students are being taught when they get in is not be as open-minded as possible, but police each other's speech. So I think it's gotten to a very difficult state that I don't really know how to fix it other than creating other ways for people to signal that they're hardworking and smart than the current system we have.
I'll also just quickly announce that there's Chick-fil-A outside, so on your way out you can go grab some of that.
Very controversial.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great. I have 3 questions. The first one would be, do you have any explanation on the slide you showed on the hostility towards socioeconomic diversity? Like why, if like somebody says, for me diversity is also socioeconomic, that's what I got from...
I can understand that.
Oh, sorry. So there is a slide you shared.
35%, that if someone wrote a DEI statement that was saying that the real lack of diversity is socioeconomic, right. Nate Honeycutt did this experiment, and 35, and he set it up like the way actual DEI statements are reviewed. And one way they're reviewed, the worst way they're reviewed, is that you just get taken right off the top. So 35% of professors looking and administrators looking at that said nope, even because it wasn't about race, gender, etc.
And do you have an explanation for that? Like, is that something that
okay, this is where I start to sound like a Marxist. I think class has largely fallen out of the discourse when it comes to elite higher education because they, one, find working class kids a little too hard to actually deal with. And that essentially there's a lot of guilt about the idea that they know these institutions are overwhelmingly the wealthy. They know that, I mean, like when you look at Harvard, for example, like I don't know why people continue to hire from Harvard with such great confidence that they're going to get great employees, because about half of the white attendees at Harvard are either legacies, kids of professors, or sports, which is laughable because you don't really have sports at Harvard. And the average grade is 3.8. The average grade is 3.8. So you might be getting you might be getting a really talented kid who got there partially on their own steam and a hell of a lot of luck, or you might be getting like the dopey kid of a major donor who got a 3.8 anyway because everybody does. I feel like it's becoming a less reliable signal, which I do think creates an opportunity. But the book that I've been recommending to everybody, and because I got into Stanford Law School, I didn't come from like an economic class where I thought that I didn't think actual people went to schools like that. So I was really kind of blown away to be there. And one of my best friends was a carpenter. But when you actually, who was a carpenter for 10 years before Stanford, went to the law school, did just fine, went back into carpentry afterwards. He's still one of my best friends to this day. But there's a book called Poison Ivy by Evan Mandry. And I was always on this kind of class rant because we were the exceptions, not the rule, about the fact that, yes, there is some class mixing, that there are some socioeconomic, there are some ways to rise up. But at the same time, for every one kid who comes from the bottom quartile, there's legions more that come from the 1 or 10, the 1%. For me to read a book and actually realize that the maintenance of upper class status, how much worse it was than I thought when I already thought it was terrible, is another reason why I'm feeling not exactly happy about elite education. And I really recommend Poison Ivy to everyone.
Right. Okay, so thank you so much. The other 2 questions were, do you have evidence of the same phenomenon outside the US, Europe, Canada, and is it worse or better, and why?
Not that I trust enough. I take my research very seriously, actually, Eric Kaufman has done great research on the situation in Britain, and the situation in Britain is about equally bad, some ways worse, some ways better. So that's who I'd refer to you there. In other countries, one of the problems is that their university systems are just so fundamentally different than ours that it could be apples and oranges. But yeah, the situation in Britain is bad, to say the least. And it's very similar to what's going on. The entire Anglosphere is facing this. Australia seems to be handling it a little better. But again, that's my impression from somewhat limited research. Yep. Huh? Canada? No.
Okay. Right. And last question. You mentioned.
The situation for academic freedom in Canada is terrible. Yep. As best I can tell from the research, yeah.
And the last question would be, so you mentioned at the very end that you're working on solutions. Is it okay to line out some of them, because I'm not sure?
As far as solutions?
Yep.
I think that we should be trying to massively de-bureaucratize higher education in the United States. I think that would. I think that it's shameful that higher education has acted as a cartel to increasingly raise tuition every year, pretty much in lockstep with each other. And what have they spent that money on? They've spent that money on more and more administrators. And what do some of those administrators do? They police the professor and student speech and actually create mob censorship. I think that the lack of outrage at what higher education has done in the United States, how selfishly it has promoted its own interests above all other things, is something that should have every American outraged. I, for example, could absolutely come to support absolving a lot of student debt, because I do think that this cartel has created a situation in which they're putting a lot of Americans into debt. But to do that without demanding things that actually reduce the overall cost of higher education is insane. It's rewarding that situation. So I think there should be massive. I think we should figure out some kind of administrator to professor ratio and say, like, listen, you're not, just like any nonprofit, you're not sufficiently efficient to garner all of this federal aid with this kind of administrative bloat and imbalance. I think we should have new and smaller experiments. So I'm really hopeful for projects like University of Austin. There's also Minerva University in San Francisco that's trying some really intense stuff, like something that actually a kind of project that you can actually fail out of. I think that a lot fewer jobs should require bachelors. I think that's something that I think Republicans, Joe Biden supports this, by the way, and I was very heartened to hear this. I think that Joe Biden and the Republicans should actually require that fewer jobs require bachelor's degrees. I think that we need large-scale reform. I think we need a lot of experimentation. I know that Sal Khan is working on sort of a school for autodidacts. And I think about when a lot of my frustration from this also comes as an employer, because when I hire someone from Yale, for example, I will absolutely say that I'm usually getting a pretty smart kid who has a good work habit and knows a lot in some field. I don't know if they know how to write. I don't know if they know statistics. I don't know if they know how to actually work with other people. And the grades don't tell me anything because of grade inflation. What would be better, and there are some experiments in this with the idea of EduBlocks, for example, like that essentially, if I could see that someone came into my office and they'd read and understood the following 30 books about freedom of speech and First Amendment, that's always a much better indicator than what fancy school they went to. And that's usually what you're actually trying to get at in the interview. Is this your passion? Is this something you would do? So I think we need lots of alternative ways that people can signal that they're smart and hardworking. I think we need big-time reform. We need to demand cost-cutting measures, all across higher education. But yeah, I think it's serious, and I think the American public should be angry. Stuart.
Hi, I'm Stuart Taylor.
Oh, yeah, I think you need the thingy.
I'm one of two folks representing Princetonians for free speech, more than two, Leslie, my colleague, and it's a sort of depressing scenario. I kind of thought I knew how bad things were, but you dramatize it in a way that sends me plunging into giving up. But and this is a
We need a new planet.
semi-serious question. Given how bad things are and how they're getting worse and how universal it is,
Yeah.
why shouldn't people who believe in free speech, viewpoint diversity, and traditional liberal values just give up on American universities, boycott them, avoid them, tell your children and grandchildren not to go near them, try and run them out of business as fast as you can? Why not do that? And if not, I think you're going to say there's a reason not to.
Yeah.
What should we do, other than cut the money and all that? You had a long list. Leslie put a lot of your proposals in a long article.
Some of them pretty radical.
Yeah, and it'd be good to hear a little more about those after you tell me why my proposal is wrong.
Yeah, no, and I get the sentiment, believe me. I get the sentiment 100%. But unfortunately, when you're allowed to have $60 billion to one side, like Harvard does, I mean, I think that's the GDP of Lithuania, you're kind of unstoppable. You know, you're a perpetual motion machine. Princeton, you know, like what's his name? The outliers. Malcolm Gladwell, yeah. He talks about Princeton becoming a perpetual motion machine, where they can fund the entire thing just on the gravy from the endowment. These institutions aren't going away, so you have to keep engaging with the elite ones, so they're at least not quite as bad as they would otherwise be. I do think that there are the occasional bright spot. One thing I will say for my alma mater, after acting, in my opinion, very shamefully, dealing with a judge that, you know, I disagree with on a million things, but I'd still come and listen to him, is that Dean Martinez at Stanford actually came out with one of the best statements I've seen, period, in response to any of these things. And she essentially endorsed the Calvin report, which is that there should be institutional neutrality on political issues, and there should be departmental neutrality on particular issues, which both me and Nadine Strawson have come around to, and we're considering actually having that as a formal opinion. The problem is you can't give up on elite higher education because they are too important and too powerful, and it's frustrating. I do think there's still hope for state schools, to be clear, but they should be cutting their bloat in a big way. I do think there's something about having kids who come from working class backgrounds that actually decreases the ideological craziness that you see in higher ed. So you have to keep trying to reform it, but I do think that some of the measures that I think the fact that we're not talking about bigger, you know, and more radical solutions. I mean, like, one thing that's going to get me in trouble is I don't totally know why we tolerate massive public funding of higher education when they allow for things like legacy admissions. What is that about? What public good does that do? It doesn't do any public good. And here's where I sound like a Marxist again. It propagates the ruling class. It keeps them there forever. And this is one of the reasons why people should be, when it comes to some of the state schools in California, dropping the SAT. In my opinion, what they're trying to do there, since people are starting to wonder if higher education is worth it, who is that going to benefit? That's going to benefit the untalented kids of alums, the kids who are trying to get into varsity blue. Those are the kids who benefit from that stuff. So basically, like, what I feel like happened in California was a couple of movie stars wanted to get their kids who don't really care about college into USC and were willing to cheat to do it. And California, in response to that, punished a couple of those parents, but then otherwise said, you know what, let's remove anything that could prevent the kids that we want to admit to get in. And all of this stuff, I think, actually is a way of sort of like solidifying people in the upper class to a degree. And it decreases social mobility. It's because, yes, I get the argument that standardized tests can favor wealth to a degree, but they favor wealth the least of most of the measures. Now, if you're valedictorian of your school, that actually is a very good indicator. But whether or not you played lacrosse, that's basically just asking you if you were wealthy. Same thing with that rowing thing. You know, that's a test. Did I get a benefit for working at Burlington Coat Factory? No. And it's insane that people don't get benefits for that. So basically, like, I think that some schools are going radically in the wrong direction. There are openings for schools to be much better. University of Chicago, I mean, somehow they're doing it. Columbia, so we have a ranking of schools according to freedom of speech that heavily relies on what students actually say about it. Somewhat to my surprise, to be honest, Columbia finished dead last out of 203. I actually didn't think Columbia was quite that bad. Penn, which has been awful on a lot of these issues, was second to last. Yale was in the bottom 10, no surprise there. And then Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, I think, got pretty bad there. Basically, no elite college did well except University of Chicago that got number one on its own steam. And university presidents come to me now thinking that they can kind of sweet talk their way into like a better ranking on our list. And so I open up saying, I don't affect the rankings. You're going to get what you're going to get. There's no way to the one thing that we do have some discretion on is if you earn a lifetime achievement award for censorship. And believe me, it's tough to earn those. But so far, Georgetown has earned it, you bet. Yale has earned it. DePaul University in Chicago earned it. So I do think there's an opportunity for some schools to be better on this stuff, but I think that the sense of urgency is insufficient. And I'm tired at the same time of people who want to do reform coming up with unconstitutional plans for fixing it, because guess what? It won't work anyway because it's going to be defeated in court. And of course, we'll oppose it. But there are other ways we can do this.
Thank you. My name is Bob Pollack. I suspect most people here reasonably agree with most of what you're saying. There may be people who don't, but maybe they're quiet. It would be nice to hear. One of the things you rarely get at a Princeton lecture is enough discussion, so to speak, afterwards. And I think the sad turnout maybe is kind of representative of why there's not, the outrage just ain't there. And as I think you said, people generally are going to pursue their own self-interests, whether they're politicians looking to get reelected or administrators looking to build up its college reputation. I'm just curious, so we could agree with a lot of the things you say about the system. What's education for? Is it for scholarly pursuit, or is it for socialization, or for teaching ethics, or whatever? The word you used before was almost systemic, that hateful word about what's going on in the universities. But it's getting...
I think it's systemic Marcuseism.
What's that? But the trend is clearly going in the wrong direction. I think I agree that dropping the standardized tests, and you can argue them one way or another, is taking an element that at least levels some playing field. What playing field, we can argue. But you talk about California, they're spending a ton of money and energy creating this ethnic studies program throughout the state, while the students are failing reading, writing, arithmetic. And they're putting all of this energy into, and is it because the people who care about that are more outraged, so to speak, than we who think that there's not enough discussion in the world that's open? I don't know. I just think what's the first step? I'm thinking, someone asked a good question, what's the solution? And we're not going to change the educational system overnight, but is there one thing, for example, that administration could put in place that would at least be a small step to try to reverse the trend, which seems inexorable?
Every school, there are definitely lists of reforms that every school could do that would help someone. Absolutely. When it comes to kind of like bigger reform, I definitely am coming around to the idea of there being a national Leonard law that these massively publicly subsidized universities should be bound by academic freedom and First Amendment standards. That's not an official fire position, but that's one that I've definitely considered. But when it comes to big ideas, I would like to see a really, really difficult test that would be very prestigious that would allow you to get a BA just by passing that test. Because I am always, I think we've reached a point where people from different economic classes don't even meet each other. And I think that there are autodidacts out there. So I went to a weird school for a poor kid. I went to American University, but I went there because I was on scholarship. And then when people tell me that, like, oh, poor kids can go to all these schools, they can go to all these schools for free. Guess what? In my second and third year, they started taking my scholarship away from me, and they only gave it back after I wrote in the student newspaper that this school baited and switched me. So what the kids are afraid of does actually happen, because when they see $70,000 a year is the sticker price, like they would need it in writing that it's going to be completely paid for them, and also they're going without 4 years of work. So I think if there was some other way to signal that you are an amazingly talented person who is willing to read all the books and really understand them, I think that would be much better for social mobility. And I think it would, if that existed, I think it would scare some reform into some of these elite institutions.
So I'm curious what you think should be the role of current students and professors on campuses when any cancellation event, something of the sort that you described happens. What should the response be?
Yeah, that is a great question. One of the things that we're trying to do at FIRE is we're trying to create a free speech movement. We're trying to add 1 million people to our emails, to our Twitter followers, and in our first year, because the American public still loves freedom of speech, left and right. And that's really clear. It just isn't so great, particularly at elite higher education, because when you're the supermajority, you start seeing freedom of speech as more of a nuisance than a protection, because you don't really need it anymore. You're the man. So I think that joining what you're doing now is important. I think joining with FIRE, because what we want to create is counter pressure that's not just legal. We want to create cultural pressure. So, for example, off campus, when PayPal announced this insane policy where they would say they would confiscate $2,500 of your own dollars for every instance of misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, et cetera, and the language was in their own, in their sole judgment constituted that. They're basically saying, we're going to take your money away if we don't like what you had. There was no way to defeat that in court, because a company can do that, maybe not for long. But we got, one of the ways we were able to push back was just by grassroots, just by getting those emails. So I think that when people know there are people on the side of freedom of speech, it makes a difference. But like you said, this is kind of disappointing. Like the unpopularity of this movement on campus is part of something that has been in the works for my entire career. I call it the slow motion train wreck. I saw it coming when I was at the ACLU in 1999. That essentially there are people intentionally trying to change the political valence of freedom of speech so it becomes a dirty word. And there are people very consciously doing this since 1965 and before. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, they've won. But I do think you have to not give up. I think you have to work with FIRE. I think you have to explain some of the basics of freedom of speech. You have to defend it proudly. And, in some cases, some administrators got to be fired. Like, when you find out that someone is actually helping organize some of this stuff, the idea that those people keep their jobs is crazy to me. But that is a hard fight. So, but you got to keep fighting. I can't hear you.
I think most of what I wanted to ask is already. Is it better?
There we go. Yep.
So I think most of what I wanted to ask has already been addressed, but I really want to emphasize somehow how depressing it is. I think it's even more depressing than what you told us. The fact
I brought you into my own misery. I apologize.
This place is empty almost.
Like I said, though, better than a shout down.
So how do you respond to this? I mean, obviously something more dramatic needs to be done in order to get people to wake up to what is going on. So I don't know, maybe you can elaborate. You already addressed this, but maybe since
Yeah,
it's so
no,
important, maybe you can
I talked about
elaborate.
a lot of radical ideas. I was actually kind of shocked that I included so many of them in the Princeton report.
No, but in particular, specifically to this issue of people being aware of what is going on, because, I mean, you know, that's...
Well, here's the thing. And I'm not going to be nice when I say this. I talked to a class at Harvard, and I guess I shouldn't have been surprised, but they were some of the most arrogant students I've talked to in my entire life. Like they knew nothing about the topic of cancel culture, but immediately assumed it was just about the powerless overcoming the powerful. And it's like, no, it's about the general will. Like these are popular opinions on campus that you're defending. So when brave people, at Stanford to go shout down the Federalists who were hated back in my day. Like like I said, it's like the manifestation, of the general will at some of these places. So how do you actually get people to understand it? You got to start a hell of a lot earlier. You have to have some of this programming in high school. We're figuring out how to do that again. But K through 12 is also part of the problem. I've become a full-on vouchers guy, which I never kind of thought I did. Yeah. Having trouble with that. Oh, education schools, yeah. No, and it's a shame because my kids go to public school in Washington, D.C., and a lot of their teachers are amazing and wonderful people, but everything you hear about kind of like the wackadoo ideology is all there. And what kills me is, here's another class complaint. Before Stanford, I worked with inner city high school kids in D.C., overwhelmingly black and brown, brilliant kids. Black and brown gifted kids. And DC, overwhelmingly led by ideology coming out of education schools, got rid of all the gifted and talented programs in Washington, DC, screwing over the students that I worked with for years. So yeah, the education schools are uniquely bad, and that's one of the reasons why, with a lot of debate over K through 12, watching some other free speech organizations essentially make the argument that K through 12 teachers should decide everything about the way things are taught. It's like education school graduates dominate when it comes to college administrators, which I actually didn't know until relatively recently. And of course, they dominate K through 12. And it's some dysfunctional. It's embedded with a lot of dysfunctional ideas. And so when I think about other ways to solve it, like if I had an ideal K through 12 school, it would be overwhelmingly staffed by people who had a career already. And wanted to teach kids in their 50s, 60s, and 70s. Like have cross-generalization and none of the sort of rigid ideology that you get in education.
This is, by the way, uniquely in the United States. I mean, for example, to become a professor of mathematics or physics in Europe, you need a degree in math or a degree in physics. You cannot just go to a school of education, except maybe for the 1 to 4, the first 4 grades.
Yeah.
But high school, certainly. In order to teach at high school, you have to have a degree in the particular field. That's just uniquely United States. I don't know how to solve that.
Yeah. I think we're going to, when we're going to? Sure, yeah.
Sorry. Hi. So generally, something that I'm curious about with this topic generally is with making resolution approachable in terms of with bipartisan polarization, especially with regards to protests.
Yeah.
Because I think as you've kind of pointed out, a big difficulty in negotiating free speech concerns is basically cases where the censored side says it's cancellation and inappropriate, and the other side it's morally justified, and it applies, back and forth across the board.
Yeah.
And so, what I worry is where, in cases where it does become, this outrage becomes extreme, in potentially more middle ground or edge cases. I worry that there are cases where things that are absolutely absurd protests to make about questions about finding the clit or what have you, as the side of people who are making true valid good faith protests that happen to just be in response to maybe a speaker who's, you know, like a little bit more
Oh, and
controversial.
we defend we defend non-shout downs all the time,
Right.
And we win.
Yeah, no, like I am like completely in favor of that. I'm just more like one thing that I have is like, so basically I worry about like how just with the massive polarization about how student protests of speakers might have like chilling effect for genuine productive political protest, like to the end of their free speech, just because how people on like both sides politically can become furious about most instances of protesting speakers generally insofar as that speaker agrees with them. So basically, long story short is like, how can we work against censorship on campus, especially with promoting what is like clearly necessary development of political engagement and protest in students, like when the atmosphere is so polarized, like obviously like reasonable standards that will allow for good faith, meaningful protest is good, but like, are we past the point of no return with this? Because like, I don't know how, you know what I mean?
As far as things that need to be taught that I believe are barely being taught at all, if at all, and this is funny for a constitutional lawyer to say this because I'm supposed to be all about debate, you know, and I have come around to something much simpler, which is listening. And some of these listening projects that I've seen, like I did a panel for the Root Strikers, which is Larry Lessig's group, where he's trying to actually, you know, Lessig's goal is to kind of overcome what he sees as sort of plutocracy in the United States. And I think he has a valid point, don't always agree with how he's going to get there. And I did a panel with, I was a moderator, I hate being a moderator, and there was a preacher there who, and it was like it was a preacher, an activist, and a guy from Kentucky, who was like an older guy with like a big beard, and another person. And the preacher opened up just talking about like, I can't be friends with Trump people, I can't be friends with Republicans, these are all evil people, all this kind of stuff. And everyone else agreed. And actually, interestingly, the guy from Kentucky wasn't a Trump fan either. But he hadn't said anything until about 15 minutes in. And so I finally tried to be a moderator, and I was like, you know, rather than this just being a political bashing session, let's see what the guy from Kentucky has to say. And all he said was, listen, I understand what you're saying. I'm not a big fan of the man myself, but I live in a town in Kentucky that 5 years ago had 1,200 coal mining jobs, and now has 400. And the whole room went quiet. You know, we were like, oh, that made that incredibly vivid. And so I think that I would be amazed, and I think it would be incredibly valuable if during orientation they did more stuff like that. And again, like I come back to this a lot, hearing from people who come from different regions, people who come from different classes, people that are outside your bubble, but with a listening idea, because that's one of the things about protest, that I think protest is an act of certainty. You know, and I think that we should be trying, in higher ed, you should be trying to erode as much certainty as possible. And unfortunately, I feel like we're cultivating it. Because like, yeah, the idea of going to Judge Duncan and hearing what he has to say, even if you think it's bullshit, you should still hear what he has to say, because sometimes they're going to be better arguments than you thought, or sometimes they're going to be worse arguments than you thought. But you have to know what they are first. So I do think that we have a sort of plague of moral, I even call it moralistic certainty, that higher education should be undermining, but I think it's actually supercharging.
All right, thank you so much.